Mr. Bryant, how long have the committee known about this email?
For the last week, we've had it, and obviously we had a session of the Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday. But can I just remind people why this matters? I, along with nearly every MP I know, had hundreds and hundreds of constituents, relations and friends and people who'd worked with armed forces, British armed forces in Afghanistan, who got stuck in Afghanistan. So what we've been trying to do on the Foreign Affairs Committee is try to dig away at why did some people get left behind, but Penfarthing and Nowzad were allowed to evacuate their animals. And whether you think that was the right decision or the wrong decision, what we came up against was, first of all, we had the Prime Minister saying it had absolutely nothing to do with him, the Prime Minister's spokesperson saying it had nothing to do with him or Carrie, Mrs. Johnson, and yet we had the Prime Minister's PPS saying that he'd been involved in the decision, which was then denied, and now we've got a letter from Lord Goldsmith, or from Lord Goldsmith's office, making it absolutely clear that the Prime Minister was involved. So, in a sense, this goes back to the moral authority of the Prime Minister and whether the Prime Minister tells the truth.
But do we know, the email says the Prime Minister authorised this. That's what the email says. But are you confident that it means that he did authorise it, or could it be a certain amount of grandstanding or inflammation by the person writing the email, Zach Goldsmith, who clearly had his own agenda, wanting to get his charity in a place where they could get people out of Afghanistan?
So either a government minister in the House of Lords who's a minister in the Foreign Office has lied, or the Prime Minister has lied. I'll kind of take your pick. It's, I merely note that the Prime Minister himself earlier today said in Prime Minister's questions that the ministerial code applies to him, and if somebody has lied, then they do need to resign. My anxiety about this is I care passionately about the situation in Ukraine. The Foreign Affairs Committee, we visited Ukraine last week. We went to within 80 meters of Russian troops. And stared at them down binoculars kind of thing. And we are aware that we need a Prime Minister at this moment who has all the moral authority he can muster. And yet there are endless stories about whether he's told the truth, whether he's cut corners, whether he's told fibs. And it just means that it's so corrosive in British politics. We've changed Prime Ministers quite often in times of war. Lloyd George quite rightly took over from Asquith in 1916. Of course, most famously, Chamberlain had to give in 1940 and was replaced by Winston Churchill. I just think, to be honest, that with all these stories crowding in on the Prime Minister, he has no moral authority, he has no ability to lead the country, and this is just another part of a massive jigsaw of what I've called before a shower of shenanigans.
The Number 10 have released a statement just a short time ago. The Downing Street says it remains the case that the Prime Minister didn't instruct officials to take any particular course of action. What do you say to that?
I just don't believe him. All right, so is he sacking Lord Goldsmith for telling a fib? I mean, what should happen now is, of course, that the Prime Minister should come to the House of Commons tomorrow and answer questions on it. Pretty straightforward. His authority and his integrity and his honour are on the line. He should come to the Chamber and defend it.
What evidence do you have that animals and staff from this charity were given priority over other people?
Well, we've already asked a whole series of officials in the Foreign Affairs Committee about the process whereby they were given permission to land. It was an additional slot that was provided, which could have been made available to other people, who could have been evacuated instead. I mean, we've also, my personal feeling is, whilst, of course, the military did a fabulous job and lots of people did a great job in trying to process people very, very quickly, that one of the problems was that the Foreign Secretary himself was so he kept on making new promises to new categories of people who were going to be evacuated, and by the end there was no sense of priority whatsoever, which meant that people who were extremely vulnerable, people who'd worked alongside British forces and whose lives were at risk when the Taliban took over, were left behind. So some of us, notwithstanding the fact we managed to get a large number of people out, are very, very critical of the fact that the the process was so badly handled, especially when you consider that the government had, well, 18 months and more to prepare for this eventuality, and it had been predicted by so many people.
And in terms of the committee, and you said they've had this email for a week, what has been the reaction of those on the committee? I'm afraid, as chair of the Standards Committee, I know the rules quite well, and it's not for me to reveal what members of the Standards Committee, of the Foreign Affairs Committee, think in a private deliberation. But we will be returning to this, I'm absolutely sure.